To me, globalization is quite simple. It is an integration and a harmonious coming together of culture, politics, economics, etc., and social and civic understanding and activities. And in the last century, in the 20th century, probably the US was responsible for the phenomenon that we refer to as globalization. I believe, obviously now China is taking a far bigger role in globalization. The influence of China into other parts of the world, China being open to other parts of the world coming to China, the influence is huge. But importantly, and again it's linked to globalization, is that individuals, groups, companies, governments should be striving for what I call an our way, the best of both. And that's where you start to develop a global culture that is good for individuals, good for groups, good for families, good for civic society, good for business. So, it really is about don't let ignorance be the enemy. Maybe a good starting point is that my professional life is very, very interlinked with my personal life. I've always really been brought up with an understanding of what global mobility is and what cultural integration is. My family were immigrants themselves from Ireland to England. So, I saw and grew up in a culture and environment of a family trying to integrate. So, in my professional life, I've always worked in an international environment because I've been drawn to it. I've always been curious about how people interact, the challenge of dealing with new cultures, the opportunities that lay ahead for us. As the human race, things are going to change, things are going to be very different. In terms of maybe one sentence about me, I take my work and what I'm trying to achieve very seriously, but I don't take myself that seriously. There are many, in my experience, there are many different interpretations of globalization. To me, globalization is quite simple. It is an integration and a harmonious coming together of culture, politics, economics, etc., and social and civic understanding and activities. And in the last century, in the 20th century, probably the US was responsible for the phenomenon that we refer to as globalization. I believe, obviously now China is taking a far bigger role in globalization. The influence of China into other parts of the world, China being open to other parts of the world coming to China. The influence is huge. So I think in terms of the phenomenon of globalization, at the end of this century, people will look back and probably say that the 21st century was where China was responsible for globalization. Obviously China, in becoming politically and socially and economically more well connected with the rest of the world. Technology obviously has played a huge part in that. China and other countries around the world now have greater opportunities to be linked to cultural, social, political and economic activities in the rest of the world, and it's been a natural progression that China is now in a position in all of those areas to have a major influence on the world, and is doing so. I can remember being a child and a Chinese restaurant opened near my home in London, and it was amazing. It was something that was so strange. And now the cultural influence and the social influence of China and its people and its immigrants around the world is huge, and it's become normal. And that's another good example in my mind anyway of globalization. It depends how experienced you are, but when I first started working in an international environment, I used to suffer from what I would call culture shock quite often. And that was quite simply where I would find the way other people do things a bit strange. Now I'm sure they were thinking the very same thing about me. And I learned a really huge lesson here in Beijing about 25 years ago. It's only a small thing, but it stuck in my mind. I was asked to be the MC, the host at a conference here, and there was lots of media in the room, 300 or 400 media. It was to do with a certain joint venture, a relationship that was going to take place. And I spoke no Chinese, but at the start of that conference, I said, "Ni man hao." And at the end of my introduction, I said, "Xie xie," and everyone just really clapped. And I learnt in 2 minutes that the relationship and connection you can make. So therefore, that leads to the point that you ask is, I think when you're dealing with another culture, you have 4 choices. How are you going to do? There are thousands of definitions of culture. My definition of culture is, it's the way we do things around here. So I think when you first get introduced to another culture, you have some choices to make. 4, I believe. You can either do what I call a no way. You refuse to engage, you ignore it, just doesn't matter. You can make a choice perhaps to do a my way. I don't care what you guys do here, I'm going to do it my way. Sometimes that may be possible, but it usually comes with power. There is okay, I'm going to do it your way, because it makes sense for the relationship, because it makes sense for the business. But importantly, and again it's linked to globalization, is that individuals, groups, companies, governments should be striving for what I call an our way, the best of both. And that's where you start to develop a global culture that is good for individuals, good for groups, good for families, good for civic society, good for business. So, it really is about don't let ignorance be the enemy. People often assume that the further 2 countries, nations are apart in the world, then the more likely that the cultural differences will be bigger and bigger and bigger the further you go away. And there are examples of that, of course. But it's an interesting one for me, from my personal observations and from my many experiences in China. If you think about my country, Ireland, it's on this side of the world, and you have China on this side of the world. But in many ways, and I found it very, very useful, the culture between Ireland and China are similar in some key areas, in some key values. So whilst there are cultural difficulties and barriers to negotiate for someone like me coming to China, of course there are. I'm quite lucky, being brought up in an Irish culture. I had a kind of a head start because I'm very much myself personally and business-wise relationship oriented and group oriented. And then I started working in this fantastic country and people were the same, and it was like, wow, I can do this. There really is a lot of similarity, which is why also I believe, I think one of the success stories of globalization, of the mobility of people, is the Chinese community, Chinese immigrants to my country, Ireland. Every migration or every move is going to have issues, but overall, Chinese people who have moved to Ireland are very well integrated. They've brought lots of their own culture, which is really respected. They have integrated where needed, and Chinese people in Ireland are highly respected and highly valued, and there's a great warmth about Chinese people. As I said, do a bit of homework, be open to other people's ideas, be prepared to be challenged, that you may actually not be right, listen to advice, and as I said, the key phrase, don't let ignorance be the enemy. I was brought up very much with a mindset and an interest, almost a passion about cultural integration and mobility and the effect it has and the benefits it can have for families and people and society. In one of my previous roles, for example, I worked for BT, British Telecom, and I was the regional corporate affairs director for Asia Pacific. So I was based in Singapore, but I spent a lot of time traveling around. BT is a very, very large company. I think at that stage it had 130,000 people. My philosophy and my passion as such has always led me and been attracted to roles that I think can make a difference. And BT, for example, communications is everything. And we built a very successful company with a meaningful brand and a meaningful purpose around the notion, or what I used to call a simple but universally recognizable truth. And that is that better communications leads to better relationships, which in turn leads to better business, better life, and a better world. And with Kyle in Prime Group, similarly, we have built a purpose built around the notion of what we call creating futures. And it runs through every part of our business. It's being interwoven into our culture and our behaviors. And that is, in this globalizing world, in this world of increased mobility, in this world of more integrated culture, more freedom of travel, we are creating futures. Our mission is to create futures for individuals and families, to create futures for local communities, to create futures for local economies and national economies. Globalization, global mobility is inevitable. It can either be done very well, or it can be done very badly, or it can just be ignored. And we're at School of Thought, and my philosophy, and I hope that I can motivate my colleagues at the same time as this. Our motivation is to do our bit. We can't change the world overnight, but you've got to start somewhere. So start local and build up globally. I don't really like using other people's quotes, but there's a quote that has stuck with me all of my life. There's an American anthropologist called Margaret Mead. As I said, I don't normally use quotes, but she said something that's just stuck with me, and it really has guided my heart and my mind during my professional life and my personal life. She said, never doubt that a small, committed group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. So we are a small, committed group of citizens doing our bit. So my philosophy on mobility, cultural integration and globalization is certainly driving it's why I'm here, it's why I'm doing this job. Yeah, again, we established the Future Citizen Institute really as part of our input to the phenomenon of globalization, the phenomenon of increased mobility, and it is a research and policy and think tank which helps guide all stakeholders and generate the necessary debates that are going to help with this process and help people be future citizens. Future citizens will be people with increased mobility. They'll be able to transfer homes and finances more. It is inevitable. So the Future Citizen Institute was set up to do that. I mean, we've already prepared and presented to the European Commission 2 reports on how mobility fits with international law, etc. And one of the newspapers recently wrote that it was the most thorough, most insightful academic research done on the matter. So we were pretty proud about that because it's quite a new institute. But we're there for the industry, we're there for the world to help. Bring intelligence to it, bring understanding to it for what it really is, help working with governments and other bodies to enable this phenomenon to progress more smoothly. As I said earlier, it can be managed well, managed badly, or just ignored. There is definitely a need for governments, other organisations, educational establishments, and the corporate business world to work together to help safeguard this and ensure that it happens in the right way. I mean, for example, there are 250 million people who are living and working outside of their home countries at the moment. And that represents 3% of the world's population. But that 3% are responsible for 10% of the world's GDP. So you have 3% of the population responsible for 10% of GDP. They are immigrants. So there is a bit of basic fact there that shows there are benefits. So part of our role is to help with this, help create more understanding based on fact, not emotion. It's going to increase. Migration has existed ever since we were able to walk. People moved to other areas. It always brought issues, but brought benefits even back then, I guess. It's going to increased, more flexible and free world with greater transfer of intelligence, communications, social activities, social values, economics, politics, etc. And in terms from a business side, we're seeing very clearly, and it's why we've built a kind of a global ecosystem, I call it, to work with our clients. Our clients want to look holistically at their whole future life, their future citizenship. And that is in terms of financial management, family management, education management, health management, and residency and mobility, if appropriate, as part of the whole package. Have the freedom to move, the freedom to invest, the freedom to grow their families and their children in certain areas, as well as home. So the trend is increasing. Thank you.